All right, so we're back. This video, we're going to talk a little bit about 2D geometry creation. So how do we create different types of geometry that we saw in the previous video? Mainly focused on lines, curves, points, and shapes and that sort of thing. We're also going to look at editing them. How do we do some basic editing, from point editing, control point editing, also splitting, trims, fillets, chamfers, blends, exploding them, offset, those type of things. So after this video, you should have all of the basic tools and skills in your arsenal to begin to create basic two-dimensional geometry. All right, so let's start with points. So as we discussed in the previous tutorial, points are a basic kind of fundamental piece of geometry. So I'm going to double click the perspective and just open up our perspective. Now yours probably looks a little bit different than mine because I turned off the grid. So if you type grid, and this is probably what yours looks like, it shows the grid, but I just wanted to turn that off just so that I could see a little bit better. I thought it would be a little easier for you to see the geometry. So I just thought I'd point that out in case you were wondering, hey, my screen doesn't look like your screen. Why is that? All right, so with the points, we can create points from 3 different places. Again, those 3 different places are from the command line up here. So we can type point and create a point there. And so we can create that. We can create a point off of the toolbar down here. So we can create a point there. The other way we can do it is going up to this menu here, point object, single point. Okay. And you'll notice that's all the same, but we have a few different types of points here that we can get into that are more advanced, and we might get into those a little bit later, but we won't have to worry about that right at the moment. So the points are there. Okay. So the other thing I want to point out is that when we click point, it's going to ask you for the location of the object. So right now I just typed, or I clicked in this perspective window here and picked up created our point. It created it on the construction plane. So the construction plane is basically where we want to tell where we describe the X and Y. Where does the X and Y start? And that's at this origin here. So but I mostly, if I click on that, it's going to give me X and Y, but I can also type in the coordinates. So I could say I want it at 5, 5. So it'll be 5 units over, 5 units on the X direction and 5 units in the Y direction. If I hit enter, there it creates that 5 units, 5 units. Now you'll notice that if I'm looking at this, they're all at elevation 0. Okay. If I wanted to create a point in 3D space, all of these are in 3D space, but let's say that I wanted to create a point at 5, 5, 5, then it's going to move it up 5 units in elevation. So now when I rotate in the world, you can see that it's 5 and 5 over, but also 5 up. So we can start to create geometry and describe points by its coordinates as well as just picking in space. So if I wanted to create a point at the origin, 0, 0, 0, okay, and if I don't put that last 0 in, 0, 0, it's just going to assume that you don't want an elevation, so it'll create it at 0. All right, so hopefully that's not too confusing. It's pretty simple. And points are one of those few things that don't have a whole lot of options to those. Okay. So let's move on to the next piece, which would be a line. So we're going to type in line. Okay. And in its most basic iteration, it's just basically selecting 2 points, and that creates a line. Okay. But if I just press the space bar to enact it again, we can go and look at some of these different types. So it's good to just experiment with each one of those. So I'm going to click both sides. So it's going to say, where's the middle of the line? And you'll see that it's now creating different sides. Okay, so we've picked the midpoint and created a line. Do it again. A normal has to do with geometries or surfaces in three-dimensional, so let's not worry about that. But let's try to create a vertical one. Okay. Now you'll notice here that when I'm looking at it, it's creating it, but it's drawing it in space. So we've created a vertical line. Now we notice that in general, we're not getting any elevation. Oops. And so we click vertical to draw a vertical up. So that becomes in handy if we're drawing a box and we need to draw something that's 5 units high, for instance, then that'll help us out. So the other thing, I'm just going to delete these real quick, that we can do is we can start, and you'll notice how you might have ortho turned on down here, and I think that's default. You can hold the shift key to get rid of that for a period of time, but normally we click somewhere else and we can create a geometry. But let's say that I wanted this to be 5 units long. I can just type the number 5, and now no matter where I put it, it's only gonna draw a line that is 5 units. So that's really handy, let's say. Okay, so that becomes really helpful, and that happens even if I do it on the vertical. Oops, line, vertical. And so let's say that I wanted to start out at 5 and 5. So that's the coordinates. Now I want it 5 units tall. So I type 5 again and click. So now I've created a line that's located there at the coordinate 5, 5, but I've also then made it 5 units tall. So that's a really handy kind of piece of that. All right. Some of the things that we can do with this is that we can come over here. I think this is an important piece, is this edit points on and off. This becomes really handy. So if we click on the edit points, then you'll notice that we have these 2 points up here. Okay, and those describe the points that we selected, okay, that created the geometry. Now those have entities in and of themselves, and they're related to this geometry. So the other thing I think that you've noticed several times when I've selected, and I haven't talked about it yet, but when I select an item, I get these arrows, and I get this weird kind of multicolored thing that is called the gumball. Okay, if you don't see this, go down to the bottom of the screen here and click and make sure that gumball is highlighted. Okay, I find that I use the gumball a lot, because what it allows me to do is kind of do on-the-fly edits. So if I select this point now, I can change the way this line works by editing these points, and I can use the gizmo to do it. So the way the gizmo works is basically I can click any one of these arrows, and that constrains its movement into the X, Y, or Z axis. Okay, so right now I'm moving constrained into the Y axis, or I can constrain myself into the X axis, or I can move this point and change this line in its elevation, okay, or Z axis. All right. Then I think that there's another really interesting aspect of this is that you can see this little grid here. That means if I click on this piece, I can move in the X and Y together, okay, but not the Z. And this is view dependent. So if I rotate around, you'll see that that snaps from the X and Y, and now I'm at the YZ plane. So if I click that, it's going to be constrained to the YZ plane. Okay? So those become handy. If I rotate all the way around, then I'm in the Z and X. And the way I can tell whether I'm in the Z and the X, see this little arrow down here? These hash down here, that tells me where I'm at. So that's how I'm really easy to be able to tell you where we're at. So that becomes really handy when you're using and editing points to really quickly change something. The other nifty thing about this gizmo, this gumball, is that if you just tap left click on one of these arrows, it brings up a box in which you can enter in a dimension. So let's say I wanted to move this 5 units on the Y. I click on the green arrow, which represents the Y, and I say, type in 5. It moves it over 5 units. Okay? If I wanted to move it down, I click on that. Let's say I want to do... Now, here's the tricky thing. I said I wanted to move it down. The blue arrow shows up. So if I want to move it down, I need to put in a negative number here, -3, for instance. That moves it down. Okay. Now the other aspect of this is that you see these arcs. This would allow us to rotate it, but as we know, points don't really have orientation in space. Okay. So that doesn't really help us any. When you get into Grasshopper, we could talk about vectors, and then that would have some meaning. But right now, let's not worry about that. So we've been editing the endpoints that make up this line. Now we can hit escape and get rid of those edit points. We can also right click here on the edit points. We turned them on again, and I can right click to turn them off. Okay? So 2 ways to go about getting rid of those. Now, when we select, we're looking at the line itself now. So the line itself is now activated. And now when we click these arcs, then we do have, it does start to rotate. So you can see the yellow is the line, it's rotating around, and you can see that it's snapping because I have the ortho selected. So it's snapping at every 90 degrees. That becomes really handy. But I can hold the shift key down, and I can rotate in a very smooth way. Okay, and if I rotate this direction, you can see that I'm holding the shift key down, rotates it. And then you'll notice that the gizmo, it's always relative to the initial plane in which this geometry was created. So the arrows move, and so now the arrow is, this gizmo is always relative to initially to the geometry in the construction plane in which it was first created. Okay, there's another little piece here that if you click on this little white circle, we can align this thing to its object or to the world. So if we wanted to get back after we've rotated or modified it, we can click on this and align it to the world, and now our gizmo is back aligned to what we normally think of as X and Y. So that becomes handy. We have some different options that we can align to the construction plane, align to the object itself. So now it's relative to the object. Okay, so real handy little things to change the gumball. We can reset the gumball. The other thing we can do is relocate it. So let's say that we wanted it at the end point. Oops. Let's click that again. I'm clicking on the little white circle, relocate, and so we can change the gumball origin. Let's do this when it's a little bit more advanced. Let's not get into that way too much yet. My bad. I'm sorry about that. Let's just keep it at align to world, because I want to keep this at a basic level. I don't want to give you too much stuff to hang yourself with. Okay, so we're going to talk about some other aspects of the gumball. These here, which allow you to scale the rectilinear color blocks, allows us to scale and those type of things, but I want to wait for that to become a little bit more advanced. So basically, if you grab it, use the gumball to move this thing around or rotate it in very basic, simple ways. One other quick thing is that you can click and just drag. So you can click and just drag something too. So you don't have to necessarily use the gumball. You can click and drag something, but the gumball is really handy. All right, so we've talked about lines. We've talked about the different things that you can do with the lines, different ways as we type the line. You remember over here we have these different ways. So just play around with experimenting different ways that you can create the lines. We're going to go into Polylines. And again, this is about, I'm holding the shift key down and just creating a series of polylines. And you can see here that we have persistent close, mod line, length, the different modes between, we can have it be an arc, creating arcs or lines. Okay, so that becomes useful. Just play around with these different things. But one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is open or closed curves. I didn't talk about that at the introduction, but that becomes important. An open curve is one in which it's like a line. It ends and it doesn't come full circle and close itself. But if we select persistent close, you can see that it's creating another line so that it closes to the other side. Okay, so if we click this and we hit enter or return, we've created a closed polyline. Okay, and a closed polyline allows us, becomes important for more advanced geometry features. It allows us to get areas and things like that that an open geometry, open curve does not allow. So difference being, again, turn off persistent close by just clicking it here. Open, it ends, the two endpoints are open. A closed encloses an area. They connect to the end, so it completes itself. Okay. It's also important to notice, I'm going to click polyline again, and I'm going to click persistent close, yes, because I wanted to also show you that a closed polygon can also kind of overlay itself and that's valid to be closed, but that can also run into some weird funky things when we start to extrapolate or try to turn this into 3D geometry. So just be aware of that. Okay, so those are the three different types. Again, just like the line, we can turn on the poly edit points, and we can select any one of these different points and move them around and change and edit the geometry by editing them using the gumball or dragging. I can just click and drag this if I wanted to. I just don't have any accuracy or control there. Escape to get rid of those edit points. And you'll notice that when I clicked on the control points on, it went right back to the same as the edit points, because remember, a polyline, it has no smoothness, so it's not trying to interpolate between any of these points, so it's going to be right on those nodes. Okay, it's basically like an interpolated curve with a smoothness or a degree of 0 instead of 3. Okay, I'm sure that that's a lot to take in right at the moment, but I think that that's important. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to talk a little bit about. We saw that the polyline, we could do an arc, but we also have arc commands. So if you come over here to the toolbar, we have lots of different ways that we can create arcs. Okay, and so arcs are very helpful to creating geometry, and they become more so as we get into complex geometry that wants to be manufactured. Sometimes it's best and easier to describe stuff that we want to make, to actually build, to try to rebuild it in arcs rather than in those 3-degree curves, because it becomes a hassle. But we don't have to get into that too directly right now. Just to suffice to say that we can create arcs, and we have start point, end points, tangents. So again, just play around with these different ways that we can create different arcs. And to go back, let's create an arc just real quickly. And again, I was just holding the shift key down to get rid out of that ortho mode. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is when we go back to our lines, I'm pressing that little triangle button down in the bottom right hand corner, is that we have some different things that we can do. So we can, if we hover over these, we can have lines as bisectors, lines, but we can do things that are like line perpendicular from curve. So what we can do, you can see how it's showing, it's being relative. We can make geometry relative to other geometry, and that is really helpful. So, and you can see that it's snapping to midpoints, but if we click here on this line, no matter where I draw this, it's going to create a line that's perpendicular to that surface. So that becomes really helpful. Okay, and we might see that being perpendicular a little bit better in this top view. So it's perpendicular. We can also create lines that are tangent to curves. So again, I can click on this geometry, and it's always going to create something that's tangent to that. Very helpful. Okay, and hopefully you can see how that's pretty helpful. So the other pieces that we can look at are, so we've covered curves, lines, and arcs. So the next thing we can do is look at these different types of curves that we have. So we talked about the control point. So when I create a control point curve, you're seeing how it's not actually going through the point, it's just using that point as a reference to smooth out that curve. Okay, so we get a really nice flowing curve. But it's not directly related. So if we turn on the control points, we see that that's where that is, and we can edit that curve by turning on the control points and changing that. I'm going to turn off, hit escape to get those off, and let's look at the edit points on. And so when we turn the edit points on, you can see this is what it looks like if this was an interpolated curve. Okay? So our next is this interpolated curve. So lines through points. So I'll try to mimic as best I can this other curve. Hit enter or right click to get rid of that. So you can right click or hit enter. Oftentimes it's just right clicking is easier. But now we can see that we've created that line differently. But we end up with something that's very similar based on its control points, but you'll notice it's a little bit different. So let's turn on the edit points and edit points. Even though we only used 4 points, it created more edit points to develop that curve. So it's not as clean as doing a control point curve. That's why I said sometimes the interpolated curve is not quite as flowing as a control point curve, because it adds all of this stuff. There's machinations going on in the background to create it. So, but if I turn on the control points to that curve again, see we have multiple. Even though I only clicked 4 times like I did here, it created more interpolated geometry to help describe that. The point is that they're similar but slightly different in the back end to how it gets created, but the same kind of pieces. Again, we have multiple ways, and so when we can get into the surface, we can actually create stuff on surfaces relative to other geometry. So that's some pretty hefty stuff. And you can play around with these different things. We can create helixes and spirals and things like that are kind of fun. So just explore a little bit. You can't really break anything, so just play around with these things. I just wanted to give you a kind of an overview of how to do it, how to create some of these things and use the gumball. Now to kind of wrap up and kind of finish up where we're doing, I wanted to show some basic editing. We showed you how to point edit these things. I'm going to create a curve here real quickly. Because we can edit through these points. So we're editing these points. We can remove edit points. Control Z gets those back. So if you ever want to undo anything, Control Z works nicely. So we can edit, we can remove these points. And if you notice here on this flyout, we can add, we can remove knots, we can insert a kink. So if we insert a knot on the curve, okay, hit enter when done. Now we have some extra points in which we can edit this thing with. So there's a whole list of things that you can do here that you can experiment with. So I'd encourage you to just kind of explore that on your own. We'll go into some of that stuff more in depth later in the more advanced tutorials, but just be aware that that stuff is there and experiment, play with it and see what you come up with. Now the next piece is that I wanted to talk with you a little bit about. We went over moving through the gumball, but we can explicitly move things as well by selecting it and typing move, just MOV, okay? And it's going to ask you from a point, at a base point, a reference point. So we can click anywhere. We can click on the geometry. We could select another piece of geometry. And it's going to be, where do we want to move it to? And so again, we can just select anywhere into the screen, okay? Or we can type in a point. Let's say we want to move it 6 units one direction, so it snaps to 6 units, and doesn't matter where I click, it's going to always be 6 units, and it's moved. Okay. We can also copy things, and there's multiple ways to copy. Let me show you. Again, I'm typing in the command line, but there's always the move icons down here to move things as well. It does the same exact thing. So there's multiple ways, command line or icon. Just remember that. So I can type copy, and so I can make copies of geometry. I'm hitting enter there to end that. The other cool way to do this is that I can copy using the gumball by holding down the Alt key. And I can make copies that way too. So there's a couple of different ways: keyboard, icon, or shortcut. And we showed how you could rotate, but down here we could type in rotate, and we could rotate something. We can also rotate it by the icon down here. Again, when you snap, I'm just holding down the shift key to override the orthographic. So that's pretty simple. The other types of things that become really handy are edits that relate to other geometry. So and those are split and join and trim. Okay, so let's say I have this arc here, and I want to split it up into segments that relate to these other two pieces of geometry. Well, I can type split, and it's going to tell me, it says, do I want to select the objects I want to split? So I want to select that, and I hit enter. Say, it tells us what to do right there. Press enter when done. Okay, then it's saying select cutting objects. Okay, well, I want this to be a cutting object, and I want this to be a cutting object, and then press enter when done. Okay, so now it doesn't look like anything changed, but now if I go back and select it, you can see that it's been broken up into different pieces. Okay, the other part of that is that I can join geometry. So let's say I have these three pieces. Let's say I created those as three separate instances, but I want to join them back together. Well, if I hold the shift key and select each of them, I can type join, and it joins them into three. And you can see up here in the command line it says 3 curves joined into 1 curve. It always tells you. Sometimes they'll be slightly off and you may not be able to see it, and it won't tell you, but look up here to make sure that it created it the correct way. Okay, I'm going to Control Z to undo that, just because I want to show you that if you don't have anything selected and you click join, it gives you the option. It tells you to select them and then press enter when done. Okay, so we have these joined. The other piece that we use quite frequently is trim. So type in trim, and it's asking you for the cutting objects. So let's say I want to cut this and this, use these as the cutting objects. So wherever they intersect, I'm going to hit enter because I'm done selecting those. And then I can say, well, I want to trim that piece off. So there, it cuts in between those two. I'm going to Control Z to undo that. So that's super handy. The other way that we can do it is a fillet command. Okay, so a fillet means that it's going to do something in between two curves. So it's saying first curve, and you can see that we have some different options here. We can radius, so we can change it so it could round off. We can join these things and trim them. So it's going to trim by default, yes. Radius 0, that means it's going to create a sharp corner. So let's try this. Select first, select second, and we've created a nice sharp Control Z to undo that real quick. And let's hit the space bar to do that again. But let's change this radius to 3. Okay, by hitting enter. Now we do the same thing, and you can see it created a nice radius between those two. Control Z. Hit spacebar. Let's do a radius of 2 this time. And we want to make sure, see, join is no. So what happens is when we do that, it's created 3 different pieces. It's created this arc in between the two of those 2 pieces of geometry as separate entities. Hitting the spacebar again, but this time we're going to click join yes. So when we do that, now when we select it, it's all one piece. It does that join command automatically. So those are all options that you can turn on and off. That is really helpful. Chamfer is another one. So chamfer distance is 1 to 1. So what this is going to do is create a 45 kind of arc between that. Or you're doing this by the distance. So it can be 45 if it's the same distance of first chamfer distance, let's say, is 2, and the second chamfer distance is 2. Create those 2. You saw that it creates kind of a 45 between those 2. Let's undo it. Hit the space bar again, and let's do 1, 2. You can see how it's different than the last time. So that's chamfer. Honestly, I don't use chamfer very often, but I use fillet a lot. Fillet does the same thing as a fillet with a radius of 0 is kind of my shortcut to trimming things around the ends. So the other thing you want to pay attention to is trimming. You want to select as close to the end that you want to trim as possible, because if it starts to get complex, it's going to be doing the nearest thing to trim. So that should be helpful to you. Let's say that we'll use fillet, radius of 0, and we're going to make sure that join is yes. Okay, and then we're going to do this one and that one. And then let's try this trim here. So we're going to select that and trim that. So we got these things. Now I'm just left clicking and dragging across to select all of them. Now I'm going to type join. So now this is all one piece of geometry. Now if I go over here, that's join, this is explode. So I can select the objects to explode and then hit enter. Now they're back into their constituent parts. If I do the same thing again and click join, I'm going to click it over here just to change it up a little bit. 3 curves have been joined into 1 curve. So that is really helpful. Let's explode that again, just by typing explode, explode. Okay. Let's delete that in between. So now we just have these 2 curves. So we can type blend, blend. And so we just follow its directions, and we can say, okay, well, it's selecting near one end and select the other end. And what it'll do is create a smooth blend between those 2. And there's some options that you can play around with, but that's another kind of thing that we can do. Control Z, I'm just backing Control Z up a little bit. Join, make sure it's joined together. Now some other things that we can do are offset. So if we type offset, there's some options. So distance, how far we want it to offset, what we want the corners to be sharp, or chamfer, round, or smooth. Right now we'll just want it to be sharp. Through a point, if we do through point, it overrides this distance. Tolerance is fine at 0.01. Both sides means it would offset on both sides. So let's just do this pretty simple right now with an offset of 4. And you can see that it's going to offset to that point. So it just takes that curve and offsets it over. Really helpful, super helpful. Hitting the space bar again, and I'm going to do the through point this time. And you can see that it's going to set up and it creates that offset. Now if I hit the space bar again, you'll notice that the distance defaults to what that through point is. So I could continue space bar, select space bar, and keep offsetting onto those distances. So that's a really handy type of thing to deal with. So with that was a pretty long one, but that gives you a pretty good overview of the basics of moving, editing, and using the gumball and that sort of thing to help create and edit geometry.